The story of twin brothers Walter and William Good is the tale of pioneering days of radio-controlled model aviation and of scientific breakthroughs that helped make the hobby the sophisticated pursuit that it is today. The story of Bill and Walt is also the saga of over 125 years of combined RC flying experience. The tale of two brothers whose inquisitive minds drove them from their earliest years to find out how things worked. As eminent members of the scientific community in this country, both men have had many honors and important achievements credited to them. Bill was a groundbreaker in the field of microwave spectroscopy and was among the first researchers in the field of color television. He is responsible in large part for the development of the light valve system that makes large-screen color television projection possible. He holds 13 patents for this invention. Walt contributed greatly during World War II to the development of the proximity fuse, which used built-in radar to make anti-aircraft shells much more effective and efficient. Like the atomic bomb, this invention was considered by defense experts to be among the very small group of developments upon which victory very largely depended. As a young man, Walt's first love was model aviation, and Bill's was ham radio. What a wonderful stroke of fate for RC Aeromodeling that these two geniuses were born together, developed mutually beneficial interests, and had the keen scientific minds that were able to give the hobby an auspicious beginning. For in the world of radio-control aeromodeling, Walter and William Good are foremost among those who deserve to be called the pioneers. The twins' scientific education began early, influenced by their father, who was a science teacher. As teenagers, the Goods flew their first RC model at the Kalamazoo, Michigan airport. But their interest in model aviation started at an even younger age.
Well, the first successful model that Bill and I built, there was a little kit model called a baby ROG. That means rise off ground. Had a 12-inch wing spread on it, and you could buy this, and we just waited for weeks for those models to come. And once they came, we put them together, and they flew very well. They had a little wind-up rubber band. You had to carve your own propeller. And then there were a series of these kits. This time was about 1927. We were 11 years old at the time. And we even ended up building what they call twin pushers. And those had two propellers on the back, and those worked pretty well too. But I noticed that I was building more models than Bill was. I liked that kind of construction. And soon after that, the little gasoline engines started coming out, and I was just terribly fascinated with those. So about that time, Bill got more interested in radio, and I got more interested in airplanes.
Yeah, I remember, Walt, those baby ROGs. Yours flew very well, and mine didn't do so well. As I remember, I built them right to the drawings, and the fuselage was very weak. You built them like you thought it ought to be, and yours did very well. Then I got interested in radio out at Boy Scout camp. They had an amateur radio station there, and the man in charge taught us the code. And I saved all my money that summer and bought some tubes and built a little 3-tube battery-operated shortwave receiver. And then I studied the code and went and got my license, and then I was hooked. In those days, you built your own equipment, so everything was from scratch. You couldn't buy a completed set at those days. And so I was building radio, and Walt kept on building airplanes.
Well, do you remember, Bill, that when I got that first gas engine, that was just the most fascinating thing, so I had to build a model for it. You probably remember that.
And you ran it on the kitchen table, I know.
Yes, we ran that engine inside the house with all the smoke and everything coming out of it. I don't see how our parents put up with that.
No, I think that's how they contributed.
Well, then you remember I saved my money then after I bought the engine. And the magazine had a plane design in it. It was called the KG, Koval Grant. It was a 8-footer. And that was the beginning of that radio model that we finally ended up with. But at this time, we flew it only as a free flight model in the contest. You'd put some fuel in the tank, let it go up, the timers would start their watches, and then you would put the timer would go in the automobile and you'd chase it cross country while it was flying cross country. Then the engine would stop and the model would land in the woods or the cornfield or someplace and the timer would stop his watch. So that model became well adjusted, well balanced. It would fly easily by itself. And then we read, remember that article we read about the Queen Bee?
Right.
That was a Navy British airplane, a very stable one with pontoons. And they put this heavy radio gear in that, and they flew that around the battleships there, using it for anti-aircraft practice, to practice shooting down these, they called them drones then at that time. And you and I discussed, well, wouldn't it be neat if we could take some of your radio experience, put it in a little tiny package, and put it in my stable model?
Right.
Do you remember that?
Sure do. That was the beginning. There were no commercial radios available that you could buy and put into an airplane. And so we had to make our own. And this is where Professor Hornbeck at Kalamazoo College came in. He allowed us to use laboratory time to work on the radios. And eventually we were able to work up a single tube super-regenerative receiver that would close a little relay when we turned the transmitter on. And Walt figured out a way of running a rubber-powered escapement to turn the rudder as we turned the transmitter on and off. So that allowed us to build about a 2-pound radio for this 8-foot airplane to carry. And we didn't know whether that was going to fly or not, but it did.
Now this little gadget we have here is the half-ounce escapement that turns the rudder on the radio control model. And it was very valuable. That's named after the escapement from a clock. And that goes and makes the turns to the left and the right for the airplane. In order to understand how that works, we have this model here. Here's the escapement part again with a little rubber band that winds it up and lets it go. And this is the rudder device here. So if I move this like the radio signal would command the receiver and the relay, it would step over to left rudder in this case, turning the plane to the left. Another step turns it back to neutral. Another step turns it to right rudder and back to neutral. You did have to remember which position was coming next. But if you were in left rudder, for instance, and wanted to go to right, you can go click, click like that, and you're in right rudder. So that's the way it worked. It worked very fast, very lightweight, and it was very positive in its action.
The transmitter that sent the signal to the escapement was a mammoth affair in comparison to current-day models. But while it was not conveniently portable, it was effective enough to bring about the dawn of a new age in model aviation, an age that was ushered in by the twins during their college days.
The very early flights that we made with the Guff model were made in 1937 during the spring of the year while Bill and I were at Kalamazoo College. And we didn't want to interfere with classes, so we would get up very early, just before dawn, run out to the Kalamazoo airport. We had permission to fly out there and plug in the transmitter and make our flights and pack up and go back and meet our 8 o'clock class. And I remember Bill saying, well, that first or second flight, I guess it was under radio control because when it came down on the airfield that time, he went over and looked and the rudder was in a different position than it was when we took off. So Bill said that was radio control. I won't argue with that definition, but later on we made the little rudder control surface greater in size and the turns became a little sharper. anyway, we didn't crash because of having too much control. We had too little, if anything. We had to change the size of the body on the plane, but these were still the original wings built back in 1935 and the original tail. But the body had to be enlarged so that it would carry all of the radio equipment. So that was one factor we had to cope with. That gave us a problem because the body was too wide to grab onto with your hands to hand launch it. And so we developed the knack of running along a wingtip and easing it into the air, and that's the way it was launched. So those early flights kept making improvements, and finally we heard that there would be the first radio control event at a national AMA meet would be held in 1937, that July. And so we prepared the airplane for that, and it was so windy I opted not to fly. Chet Lanzoff was the only one to fly that year, and he got first place in the radio control event. But we demonstrated the equipment on the ground, and the rest of the prizes were awarded to what the judges thought was good control and or bad control on the ground. In 1938, again in July, the second championship for radio control models was held, and our Guff model won that. That name Guff you might wonder about. In the late 30s there, one of the slang words that was used on the college campus was that's a lot of guff, meaning it's not too much to it. We thought that'd be a good name for a model, so it became the RC Guff at that point. At the 38 Nationals, our plane was the only one to fly. I launched it into the wind. It went up into a stall, and it stalled, dropped down once, went up into a complete loop, and just as I got back to the transmitter, it crashed in the ground. Since we were the only one to fly, we got first place, but not a very happy one that year. So the big year, though, came in '39, and Bill was flying the model that time, and the plane actually flew for 14 minutes in one flight. It went through the prescribed maneuvers of S-turns, around a goal and back, and figure-of-8 maneuvers in the air. And Bill must have hit a thermal, a rising air current, because that model just floated and floated. On a 6-minute engine run, it glided for 8 minutes, adding up to 14 minutes. He brought the landing plane around for the landing and came as close as he could without hitting any of the people that had gathered. This contest was at the Wayne County Airport in Detroit. Modelers from all over the field had heard that radio plane was in the air, they saw it turning, and they gathered around where Bill was flying. So he landed it still within about 100 feet of where the judges were standing. And we were very, very pleased. We think that was the first time that we really had a good demonstration with everything working correctly.
Yeah, after that flight at the Nationals, we received a lot of invitations to make demonstration flights at contests and all over. And one of those, we just finished up a demonstration and we're putting our gear away. And a young fella came up and asked us if we'd mind showing it to his grandfather. And Walt said, yeah, we'll be glad to do that. Well, it turned out his grandfather was Henry Ford, the Henry Ford. And he came over in a Mercury car, I think it was at that time. And we put the equipment back together and made a very nice flight. And just as it was coming in for a landing, I was controlling it. It was headed directly for Henry Ford. It wasn't very high either. And so I gave it full right rudder in hopes that it would come around in time. You always had to allow a little time for the control to take effect. And Henry stood there with his arms crossed and his hat pulled back and just watched it. Just before it got to him, the rudder took all right. I gave it left rudder to flatten it out and flare it in for a landing, and he said that was great. And he was a very conversational man and stood around and talked with us and told us about some of his experiences. And I remember one thing he said, and this was at 80 years old. He said, every morning that I get up, he says, I look forward to what new thing I'm going to learn today.
The national meet in 1940 marked the last time Bill and Walt would fly together for many years because the war would intervene. However, at the 40 Nats, the twins were the center of attention, and a country hooked on aviation recognized these young men and their brilliant successes. But while Walt and Bill were two of the forerunners in RC model aviation, they were by no means alone. For now, there were many pioneers, many contributors to the ever-burgeoning hobby, and the development of equipment and technology was advancing by great strides. For every failure, for every wrong turn, there were new successes and new victories. At the 1940 meet, the Good brothers were once again the winners, and they were considered at that young age to be the incomparable experts in the field of RC flying. If technology had been advancing in great strides prior to the war, it was after World War II that progress had to be measured by leaps and bounds. Needless to say, this equipment looks primitive by current standards. But pioneers such as the Goods, Chester Lanzo, and Jim Walker, shown here, were always looking for new refinements, new advances to give them vicarious control of the vast blue yonder. With the war over, the Good brothers dusted off their big Guff model and prepared for the 1947 Nats. By this time, RC equipment was much lighter and much more compact. In addition to lighter, smaller components in the airplanes, the control mechanisms were now more positive in their action and much finer in degree. Even the big #1 transmitter had been replaced by a smaller, more advanced design that carried the Good brothers' name and was, for a time, available commercially. So it was that Bill and Walt, armed with a new technology, a couple of more years of experience, but with the original big Guff, readied themselves for the 47 Nats, a competition that took on added importance because of the prestigious Edward Roberts Trophy. Edward Roberts was another RC pioneer whose trophy had to be won 3 times to be retired. Jim Walker and the Good brothers had each won it twice. So the 47 Nats would be the RC version of the gunfight at the OK Corral.
Did you feel a little pressure from that, Bill?
Just a little.
Just a little. Bill and I took turns flying on that. There was a radio inspector there from the FCC, but Bill had the ham license and I didn't, and we figured that the radio inspector probably couldn't tell which one was which. So we would just tell him that we were both Bill, and we would get away if he ever caught us. Fortunately, he did not, so that worked out all right. We made several flights, each time gaining more points, and it turned out when we had finished the complete contest, Jim Walker had 82 points and we had 82 points, so we had a tie at that time. You remember that one, Bill?
I sure do.
And so we asked the contest director, what do we do now? And he went back to his rule book and said, well, it says if there's a tie, then each one of the planes must make another flight and improve his previous score. Well, we first made one set of flights. Walker made one and we made one. We could not make the score better. So there was a second set and a third set, and all this time we had not been able to improve our score. You remember that part? We kept trying.
Yes.
Unfortunately for Jim, he crashed his model on the third flight. He had no spare model at that time. And so then the contest director had to decide, what do I do now to settle this?
Well, we did make an unassisted takeoff and picked up a couple of points that way.
That's right. That's what we did then. The contest director said, well, it just says here you must make more points than you made earlier. It doesn't say anything about someone crashing. If he doesn't have a plane, he can't make a flight. So that's right. We made the unassisted takeoff. That gave us 5 more points, as I remember. So we ended up with 87. Jim ended up with 82, and we took the trophy home.
This was really the crossover, though, between the simple old escapement systems and the new proportional, really complex controls. And if Jim had had any luck that year, he would have beaten us out.
Well, Bill, here it is in the 1980s. It's been almost 50 years since you and I started on this. And I'm holding in my hands here a modern transmitter, which is quite a change over what we used to use back then. And this one is pretty typical. This one has 4 proportional channels, so you can work a number of things. The power of it is about a 1/2 watt output. Has self-contained batteries, weighs a little less than 2 pounds. And this will service a radio control model right out to the limit of your vision. And there's a little tiny receiver that goes with that, tinier than a little matchbox. Weighs a couple of ounces with the equipment that goes with it. So this is pretty much standardized. It's come a long ways in the 50 years since you started working on these big ones, Bill. And this transmitter beside us here, this is the first one you built, isn't it? Why don't you tell us about old #1 transmitter here that you worked on 50 years ago?
Okay, Walt. This is the transmitter that we built for our first plane. It's a high-power transmitter. It's got almost 200 times the power output of that little bugger there, plus its big antenna. And we have a very complicated control box here. It has 2 push buttons on it. One is for rudder control, and the other one is for the elevator control. And that's all we had. So here's a 40-pound, 100-watt transmitter against your real light one there. And it looks like radio control has come a long way.
Right.
One has only to visit any RC flight gathering to understand just how far the sport has come. In the world of RC today, it is not unusual to see models with wheels that retract and lower, bomb bay doors that open, drop bombs or parachutes, and then close, missiles that are launched from wing or fuselage, and much more. All of this by radio control. The models themselves undulate against robin's egg skies in victory rolls, top hats, figure eights, and many other amazing aerial maneuvers. All of this by radio control. In watching these beautiful planes and their sky dances, it is impossible not to appreciate the men who devote their time and effort to make these magical creations a part of the radio control hobby. But in watching these breathtaking flights, we should occasionally pause to think of the men who, way back when, gave their time and effort, who suffered through trial and error, men who, in the end, made it all possible. For those are the men who so rightly deserve to be called the pioneers.